Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
This is Jane. She thinks she's just filling her car, but she's also filling the air with cancer-causing toxic chemicals used to boost octane in gas. What doesn't burn in the engine enters the air and your lungs, even your heart and brain. Bad for everyone, especially kids. Ethanol is a natural octane booster, clean burning and non-toxic. More ethanol means less scary stuff in our gas and in the air we breathe. And that makes your choice pretty plain, Jane. American Ethanol, cleaner air for Nebraska.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Doug Simon looks at the USDA's latest round of estimates. Jeff Gunsolus talks about using Dicamba in 2018. Chris Proctor discusses options for post-harvest weed control, and Jim MacDonald outlines research efforts looking at land use for crop and livestock production. Doug Simon from Tredas is our corn and soybean market analyst this week. The U.S. Department of Agriculture expects U.S. growers will bring in the largest soybean crop in history this fall. The agency's latest production estimates, released Thursday, also project the second-best corn crop ever. The updated numbers bumped corn's average yield higher to just shy of 172 bushels per acre, while slightly lowering the average yield for soybeans. We talked with Doug Thursday after the report was released and asked for his overall thoughts.
The numbers from USDA today were very quiet. They did cut the soybean yield slightly. They increased the soybean acres. They came back and they increased the corn yield and they cut the corn acres, and the stocks were really similar to what they were last month. But the report was really bullish in terms of prices. Corn was up 6 shortly after the report and 27 cents on the beans. The corn kind of faded back to unchanged for a little bit, but it was a very positive response, which was good to see. I think people were worried that the bean yield might increase. Whenever you look at USDA's numbers, if they increase from August to September, they also tend to increase into October. There was some fear about that. The fact that the bean yield came down a little bit was definitely a little constructive to the beans. More constructive than I anticipated, but that's nice to have.
Can you go through some of the details of the report with ears and pods and some of the things maybe that they saw from last month into this month?
USDA had been using what I would consider to be an outlier in terms of the pod weight, which was very high. It was higher than any other number we've ever had. They did come down slightly on that, and that's what reduced that yield by about a half a bushel. On the corn side, they did increase the yield by just under 2 bushels, and they did increase the ear weights on that. So that's from actual surveys out in the field, actual weights and testing. So I think now that they see that drop in that number on the bean side on that yield, then they start to worry, okay, maybe is USDA going to maybe, because that's such an outlier, are they going to maybe even reduce that bean yield just a fuzz more? Which on the beans, reducing a bushel off of 90 million planted acre, whatever it is, you know, just under 90 that's harvested, that has a big impact on the world, on the U.S. carryout on soybeans.
2 months ago, when the USDA released its first estimates, people were in shock. They said there's no way this happens, and now we're pretty much at those numbers. The market warmed to it, apparently?
The market believes it now. A lot of the traders and people are out there, but I think also it's easy to look at that in hindsight. If you look at where we were, I know I was here in June and we were talking about the dry conditions in parts of South Dakota. You look at the drought monitor this morning, they're normal now on their moisture. You look at parts of Illinois and Iowa and Indiana, looking at the corn yields in Indiana, everybody was talking about how wet it was there. They actually increased the corn yield in Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, all those eastern corn belt states. They left Nebraska the same. People are saying genetics. You know, we had a lot of subsoil moisture to begin the year, but we also cooled off pretty substantially during August and early September, had really good rains, and that corn crop had plenty of time to mature. So that's something you really couldn't predict in June.
Update me on harvest.
The progress, if you look at the rain from southwest Kansas up into Minnesota, everything north of that's slower. If you look at the eastern corn belt, even though they're behind pace over there, they're definitely ahead of where we are here on percentages. Soybean side of it, actually they're a little bit ahead of pace over in Illinois and Iowa and Indiana, or more toward Indiana and that eastern side, but definitely slow, which is basically kind of, spread out harvest. And it's actually made kind of some of the marketing, some of these basis opportunities. We've seen some nearby premiums for quick ship on corn and for beans. It's spread out the amount of old crop stocks that's just been overbearing on this corn market and kept basis depressed. We've seen like ADM Columbus go to 20 under, Blair improve from 28 under to 23 under here this week. So we've seen some little improvements in basis, which has been good.
Describe where the carry is in both markets here and how farmers can use that in their marketing plans.
That's a very important concept to look at. If you have today's corn price at $3.52 in the December, there's about 30 cents a carry out to July, so it's around $3.82. So if you look at selling corn off a combine today into a co-op with a 50-cent basis, you're looking at $3.52 less 50, you're looking at $3 cash corn. But if you look at that $3.82 out into July, and you look at the basis levels maybe into an ethanol plant that could be maybe 10 cents under, you're looking at $3.72. There's 72 cents of difference in that cash price because of carry and basis improvement that you could see out there. And those are definite improvements, things that you could do that are really tangible that you can improve your marketing by looking at. Beans, there's 37 cents a carry from the November out to the July, which is pretty large typically for the soybean market. But again, if you can see a basis improvement and take advantage of those carriers, there's going to be some benefits to storing beans and trying to carry them away from an oversupplied harvest market.
Is there a percentage where you like to be sold right now for risk management strategies?
For the 2017 crop, our goal is to try to sell up to our crop insurance guarantee through June on the corn, beans more into the July, August timeframe. So we're looking at now selling those bushels, or what do we want to do with those bushels above our crop insurance guarantees. With those carries that are out there, that's attractive, and the rally we've had today, it's going to make it more attractive to start trying to sell those extra bushels that we have. We'll really be interested in looking at 2018. December 18 corn sitting at $3.98. We sold 10 to 20% this last summer when we were up in the $4.25 level. We like to always look ahead and extend that marketing period, so we'll be trying to do something for that DECE 18, do a little more there, and do it in increments. We don't do everything in one fell swoop on the hedging side, but try to do increments over time. And when we get north of $4, we think that's a good place to begin.
Next week, Jeff Peterson from Heartland Farm Partners will join us to look at corn and soybean markets. One of the tools that could help farmers battle herbicide-resistant weeds continues to receive pressure. As we told you this summer, injury issues from Dicamba were showing up across the country in non-tolerant soybeans and other sensitive crops. The Nebraska Department of Agriculture says it received more than 80 Dicamba-related complaints this year. Missouri briefly suspended the use of Dicamba this summer before reinstating it with restrictions. And Arkansas will hold a public hearing in November, after which it may ban the chemical from mid-April through October. Most growers will soon make seed selections for 2018 with uncertainty about Dicamba's future or reliability. University of Minnesota Extension weed scientist Jeff Gunsolus recently wrote an article containing his thoughts on weed management in next year's soybean crop. As he said when we talked last week about challenges using Dicamba, the renewed interest in the product arose from the continuing struggle against herbicide-resistant weeds.
Historically, this chemistry, the dicamba, has always had a volatility issue, but it's been solved with different formulations. The problem is reduced volatility is not the same as no volatility. And the other problem is soybeans that are not traded to the resistance trait, the dicamba-resistant trait, are very sensitive to this chemistry. So this has been the evolution of bringing this forward, and kind of highlights in my mind that how serious the resistant weed problem is, that farmers would take on what's been somewhat of a riskier compound. There's been a number of farmers that really didn't like using dicamba in corn, and so now the renewed interest again is driven by herbicide-resistant weeds.
Well, some of those farmers would say, as they think about 2018, this is a tool we have to have in order to battle those herbicide-resistant weeds. What's the answer to that?
The have to have is a challenging question. And I think what it really speaks to, again, is the seriousness of this problem. But what it's also highlighting is the fact that the weeds kind of have a head start on us in trying to address some of these issues. But I think we need to remember that we still have other technologies. We have the Liberty Link soybean technology. We have pre-emergence herbicides, if used at full labels rates and then tied with effective post-emergence herbicides. That's an effective tool. I really think that we've gotten away from mechanical weed control and other cultural practices like rotating to other crops where we might get better control and reduce that weed problem in the seed bank. All of those things are in play here.
Would tighter restrictions on dicamba, so shorter windows that you could use it under certain wind speeds, maybe lower than last year, do you think it's a legitimate option then?
Okay, changing how the dicamba is used in tighter windows, what that will do is really change the focus of what weeds are going to work best with it. So in other words, giant ragweed, for example, is a common weed that's also has multiple resistance. It's an early emerging weed. And so by reducing the window of opportunity to apply dicamba, it should still be a very effective tool for that weed. A bigger challenge would be the palmer and the water hemp because it has a longer emergence period well into mid to late summer. And so that could definitely decrease its effectiveness in that capacity. It could be part of the solution, but it couldn't be the heavy reliance that I think is perceived by many farmers.
You wrote about this thought recently. Some farmers are thinking that they'll plant a dicamba-tolerant soybean just as a defensive mechanism for a neighbor who might use dicamba. What is your thought about that?
So my take on that is a defensive strategy is, first of all, you're not really addressing the problem. Second of all is that, to me personally, it violates a farmer's right to farm as they choose. So what if you wanted to plant Liberty Link beans and try one of these alternatives? Or if you have organic crops or fruit crops or other food grade crops, all of these things could be affected. The other aspect is, let's go back in time when we had initial problems with off-target movement of Roundup in Roundup Ready beans to corn. A lot of people would use the Roundup Ready corn as a defensive mechanism. My point here is if you spend the technology fee for this, you're very likely to use the entire technology package.
If some of the problems in 2017 were related to, as some companies would suggest, improper tank cleanout or using the incorrect nozzles, how do we fix those problems?
Well, I think some of those problems are being fixed. I think there's been a lot of work by the industry and extension folks around the country. The thing is that I think that could go a long way to mitigating some of the problems we had, but it won't eliminate them. There's still the inherent chemistry, the volatility of this chemistry. There's still the challenge of really adhering to the label to reduce those situations. If you had only 3 ounces of dicamba in a 600-gallon tank, you could still see injury symptomology.
Finally, Jeff, you worked with a survey group of producers to learn about their thoughts on herbicide-resistant weeds and how herbicides can manage them. Can you explain a little bit about that?
I think what it really boils down to is, there's been an extended period of time when weed control in corn and soybeans has been fast, easy, and cheap. The Roundup Ready era was a good 20-year run, but now we're starting to see where we have to make adjustments. And so I think what we're learning from these groups is it's still waiting for the next new Roundup technology to come along to help with this problem. Unfortunately, that is not in the cards in the next 10 years. We have to address the problem as it exists right now. So it's really about working through and integrating other practices that can add value to the existing herbicide-resistant crop technology. And so I think we have to look, and bottom line is we aren't going to solve this problem of herbicide resistance with herbicides alone.
On the Market Journal website, we'll link to Jeff's article with more of his thoughts on weed management in 2018. Nebraska farmers made little progress on harvest over the last week. The latest report from the state's National Agricultural Statistics Service shows producers advanced 1 point in corn and 4 points in soybeans. That leaves growers 16 points behind their 5-year average pace in corn and 23 points slower in beans. To discuss weed management options after harvest is complete, we talked this week with Nebraska Extension's Chris Proctor and asked how the delay, along with above average precipitation, might be a challenge for fall weed control.
Yeah, so I suppose in some ways it's to be determined, but I mean, you have all this moisture, so it's frustrating. You can't get in the field and do anything, so you want to harvest and you can't. And then if you're even thinking about fall weed control, you still got harvest standing between you and that, and so I think it's a challenge in patience, if nothing else, but then thinking about additional rain is only going to help weeds germinate.
If we think about one of the bigger weeds to control this fall, that's marestail. What is the timing window? So how much time might we have after we clear the field?
Yeah, so we have a little bit of work from last year that we did, and for eastern Nebraska, I'd say from North Platte east, from the data we have, 90-95% of that marestail that we were working with came up in the fall. But then when we went all the way out to Scotts Bluff and we're looking at some of the same marestail out there, that was entirely spring emerged. And so it's controlled very much by the environment.
We talked about this summer, but describe your research on trying to control marestail in the spring versus the fall.
Yeah, so we did find that when we applied herbicides in the fall, when the weeds were small, so it goes back to some of these basic weed control principles of the smaller the weed is when you try to control it, the more effective it is. And so I think that's a lot of what's going on. But fall applied herbicides for marestail were more effective than spring applied.
What role does corn residue play?
Yeah, that was a question we were wondering, and so we thought if we spray our fall herbicides over top of corn residue right after harvest when it's really heavy, what effect does that have on marestail control? And we did find that herbicides that are less water soluble, so something like Sharpen, that's not very water soluble, it tends to bind to that residue, and then when it rains it just doesn't wash off, compared to something like Dicamba that has real high water solubility. Once we got some rain, it washed off and we still got really good control under the residue.
What other weeds are out there that we're concerned about right now?
So there's, I think henbit would be another fall emerger. It doesn't seem to be as challenging to manage as marestail, and field pennycress is another fall emerger that could cause some concern. But I think because of resistance, that's why marestail kind of makes the top of the list. Is it once it gets into that next year, if you don't get it managed, it's a tough one to control.
Any specific ideas about rotating your chemicals that you're using for specific weeds?
Yeah, so when we talk about resistant management, I think using different herbicides is important. And some of the research has shown that tank mixing is better than rotating over time. So if you use one herbicide one year and then switch to another one the next year, that's not as effective as having multiple modes of action in the tank at the same time.
You can find more about Nebraska Extension's marestail control research by watching our interview with Chris in the June 9th episode of Market Journal. The October Nebraska Farmer says lower commodity prices are pushing farmers to look for premiums, and one of the areas with potential is non-genetically modified corn and soybeans. This month's magazine says there are challenges to using non-GMO seed, especially in beating tough weeds. In the October issue, you can read about Neely farmer Kenny Rinke, who's raised both conventional and GMO over the past few years so he can compare management needs and experience both systems. A University of Nebraska-Lincoln research team has received a $1 million grant to study how land can be used for both crop and livestock production. The award came from the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, or FFAR, a nonprofit group established by the 2014 Farm Bill that aims to use public-private partnerships. UNL Associate Professor and beef cattle nutritionist Jim MacDonald leads the university's team. He spoke with us this week about how the grant, coupled with dollars from UNL's Institute of Ag and Natural Resources, will help researchers look at developing cow-calf systems in areas where grasslands have converted into croplands.
So the FFAR grant that we received is part of the larger Nebraska Beef Research Initiative. That was a $1.5 million investment made by the Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources through some foundation grants and other donations that were made to make a strategic investment in beef cattle production systems. Of course, Nebraska has a long history of doing very valuable research in the area of beef cattle production systems. But things have changed, as they always do. Probably our number one thought process or dynamic change moving forward is that we had tremendous conversion of grassland into cropland, in that 2005, 2006 through 2012 timeframe. And so especially in eastern Nebraska, and as you move into the kind of eastern region of the Central Great Plains, there's not nearly as much grass available for cow-calf production as what there used to be.
What will this grant money allow you to do then?
So we asked the basic question as a part of this, as a part of both the initiative and then this grant, how would you develop a cow-calf production system without any access to perennial forage? And so what we've done is build on the confinement cow work that took place over the past 5 years, and then we've also been working closely with some folks in agronomy looking at cover crops, and if we graze those cover crops, they're not really providing cover anymore, so we call them double crop annual forages, but very same concept where you come in after harvest and plant a secondary forage crop and then allow cows to graze that. So we move this, instead of a spring calving herd, we move it to a fall calving herd so that their peak milk lactation matches up with that double crop annual forage. And then after the calves are weaned, they go to corn residue in the spring. And then in the summer, while the crops are growing, cows are in confinement feed, and they're fed a low quality residue with byproduct.
You hinted at this, but can you go further into the opportunity that this might bring for younger farmers who are looking to get back to the farm or ranch?
Right, so this isn't a new story, right? That it's really difficult for somebody who didn't grow up in production agriculture to have an opportunity to enter into that. So the idea is that either somebody coming back to a family farm, or it doesn't have to be a blood relative, right? If there's a cooperative agreement made with somebody who's got primarily a farming operation, that you could overlay cows onto that farming operation as a second enterprise without major investment. And what I mean by that is you wouldn't have to buy a whole bunch of land. Really, you would have to have a small area where you could keep those cows in confinement during the summer and then utilize the cropping ground for forage resources as well.
You said one of the other aspects will be an economic impact and kind of the cost to the farmer, or how hesitant or likely they are to adopt something like this.
Yeah, of course, one of the major outcomes of this is it long-term profitable? And then what are the areas of risk that we need to be aware of, or that producers need to be aware of? And of course, then there's always boundaries that in a research setting we don't understand or we can't predict, right? So one of the things that we've learned through some surveys is that, part of the reason that people don't graze corn residue is they don't have access to water on those acres, or there's simply no cows around those acres, right? So there's barriers that we can't predict. So one of the things that the FFAR grant is going to allow us to do is to bring in a socioeconomic component. We've got somebody from Ag Econ who's going to really look closely at what are the barriers to adoption that we need to understand before we can move forward with this.
As well, this will have a climate component. To what extent?
Again, the FFAR dollars allow us to bring in some expertise from the School of Natural Resources to look at flux of methane, carbon dioxide, and water. That's really expensive equipment that we wouldn't be able to afford without some outside funds. And so within a production system, now not in a head box or in a chamber somewhere, but within a production system, we'll have the ability to measure those fluxes and compare how much greenhouse gas or how much carbon emissions result per unit of food, because we think we'll be producing more food per area or per acre with this integrated system. So it's a unique opportunity we wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity to do.
Now, with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. During the last week, we've seen that big trough move across the country, and it was slowly progressed through Nebraska, so we had about 3 consecutive days of precipitation. We had snowfall in the southern panhandle, particularly in the Sidney to Kimball area. 2 to 4 inches was common. We did see a couple isolated reports of 5 inches. Hard freeze conditions on the 10th across the panhandle and most of the sandhills, and then we've seen that follow up on Wednesday morning across southern Nebraska and eastern Nebraska with temperatures primarily between 29 and 32 and a few isolated pockets of hard freeze conditions. Most of the area in the southeast remain frost-free. Now we have another precipitation event that's rolling through the state presently. That one is expected to clear out as we go through the day into this evening, and then we look like clean, clear, dry conditions for the remainder of the forecast period. As we go to the upper air models, here's that trough in play that's bringing the shower activity to the southeastern and east central portions of the state. That is expected to remain pretty much in play for the remainder of the day and possibly generating some pretty inclement weather during the football game this evening in Lincoln. But outside of that, most of the heavy activity remains to our east, just catches southeast Nebraska. The remainder of the state I don't think is going to see much in the way of significant moisture. Now as we get into Sunday, this trough deepens over the Great Lakes region. We see cool high pressures developing behind it. That means that drying conditions, favorable sunny conditions to help us dry out some of that rained areas that were rained on as the main precipitation band remains to our east. Further to the west, though, we start to see the ridge starting to make an influence. Warmest conditions will be in western Nebraska as this ridge builds in on Monday. High pressure firmly in control. We'll be looking at temperatures ranging from the mid-60s across northeastern Nebraska to probably the low 70s across southwest. And as you can see, precipitation free across the country. Now as we go into the day on Tuesday, this ridge starts to build in a little bit more into the center part of the country. That's going to raise our temperatures about 5 degrees as high pressure plays firmly from the eastern Corn Belt all the way to the western Corn Belt, and you'll be hard pressed to find any precipitation from the western United States all the way to the eastern United States outside the southeastern portion of the country. On Wednesday, the trough starts to enter the Pacific Northwest. We start to see winds out of the southwest. Low pressure over the Texas Panhandle doesn't have much in the way of any moisture or energy to work with, so very dry conditions expected again once across all the entire Corn Belt. And then as we go into Thursday, we start to see that trough deepen a little bit more into the northern Rockies. That's going to keep our conditions out of the southwest. Very dry, windy conditions will be in play. Good harvest weather. These low pressure systems will not have any energy or moisture to work on, so we're expecting dry conditions. Precipitation makes a little bit more inroads into the northern Rockies, and then on Friday, models quickly move that to the Great Lakes. We see another trough building in behind it. So most of the moisture, if it doesn't fall, will stay north of us. We look to be under the high influence of high pressure here in the Central Plains. Dry conditions once again. 8 to 14 day forecast indicates that this ridge will continue to expand toward the east, so we're going to see above normal temperatures. In terms of precipitation, dry conditions in the western Corn Belt, and it looks like moisture returns to the eastern Corn Belt.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on the USDA's October crop report, using Dicamba-tolerant soybeans in 2018, post-harvest weed control, and land use for crop and livestock production. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Next week, Jeff Peterson will be our corn and soybean market analyst, and Nebraska Extension policy specialist Brad Lubin will discuss farm program payments. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.